those species, we're studying, that most of the species that we're studying are in this declining list. And some of the few species that are stable trends are species like the swamp sparrow, which can be a little bit more adaptive and uses different kinds of wetlands than these species that really rely just on marsh wetlands. So zooming in on Calumet wetlands, which is our priority region number 1. This is just kind of a scene of what these different wetlands look like. These are the areas that we're working in and collecting data in. And if you haven't been able to visit some of these wetlands, definitely encourage you to get out and see some of these areas on the south side of Chicago and Northwest Indiana. They're really special places. And so I'm going to talk about our monitoring program, which started in 2015. You will see a dot up there in Waukegan. We did add a site momentarily. Hasn't been monitored the last couple of years, but just in case you're interested, just keep an eye on that. We monitor over 30 sites in Indiana and Illinois. And we use a protocol called the North American Marsh Bird Monitoring Protocol, which uses a method called call broadcast, which means we actually use an audio tape of these bird sounds and play it back to them to get them to respond. And the reason that we do that is that many of these species are very secretive. So they can be out in the marsh and just totally hidden. You won't know that they're present. So we play a recording to get them to call back to us so that we can tell that they're present. We work with over 15 landowners and partners. So it's really important to have an organization that's working across this larger area to be able to standardize a protocol and have many different sites that have different landowners do the same kind of study design. And then we can actually pull all the data together and understand, how birds are doing across this larger area and, take lessons learned from these different sites that have different kind of management happening at them too. And just briefly about the protocol too itself, we are only focused on the breeding season. So we'll actually, just a month from now, we'll be starting up again in May. And we'll be going out 3 times during the spring. And it's early morning surveys. So we have volunteers actually going out. We have some staff and partners that go out in the field and collect these data. They have to get out at dawn because these birds are crepuscular, meaning they're active dawn and dusk. So that's the best time to survey for them. And they have a cutoff around 3 hours after sunrise. So it's a very narrow window. They're going to whichever site that they're assigned to, and then they have a series of points where they do this call broadcast survey. And what you're seeing here on the left is a visualization of our data. This is through the Calumet Data Hub. So anybody can go on to our website and see the trends of how these different species are doing based on our data collection. And you can also compare. So these are all the different sites that we monitor, and you can see, what the bird stats are for these different sites, different years, and to see how that has changed over time. And basically with these circles up here, the darker circles have higher marsh bird occupancy, which means that they're more like occupancy is a modeled measure that these species are more likely to be present. So it goes from a range of 0 to 1. So these are our 17 focal species that we're looking at. So these species all rely on marsh wetlands. What we're talking about is a wetland that is mostly consisted of emergent vegetation, herbaceous plants, rather than trees or shrubs. And we have several what we call our secretive marsh birds that are at the top, and those are the ones that we play the audio to get them to call back. So that includes the bitterns, rails, and pied-billed grebe. Then we have a couple of our wetland songbirds, swamp sparrow, marsh wren, and yellow-headed blackbird. and a few heron species, which actually are not very common in the Calumet area, but they may actually be pushing their way north with climate change, so they're important to study as well. And then lastly, we have a few kind of other species that we're interested in as well: blue-winged teal, coot, black-crowned night heron, and black tern, which we black tern doesn't breed in Calumet, but it formerly did. So we're always really interested in being able to collect data on them. So we have 31 wetland sites, which we monitor in Indiana and Illinois. And in 2024, so last year of data collection, we found 15 of those 17 species in Indiana and 12 out of those 17 in Illinois. And we found the highest species richness at our sites in Indiana, DuPont, which is a site that's managed by the Nature Conservancy, and they've really poured a lot of effort into restoring it. Great Marsh, which is part of the Indiana Dunes National Park, and Willow Slough, which is run by the DNR. And then in Illinois, our highest richness sites are Orland Grassland, which is one of the Cook County sites, as well as Burnham and Powderhorn are also high quality Cook County Forest Preserve sites, and then Big Marsh Park, which is part of the Chicago Park District. So if you want to get out and see a lot of marsh birds this spring, just check off some of these sites. I know you got a lot of great wetlands in Lake County as well, but definitely recommend these sites. So, oh, I meant to fix the text on the top. Sorry about that. But this is showing just at Big Marsh the influence of restoration over time on the species richness. So this is one site where we've found really positive impact, and it's also really exciting because this is one of the sites that we actually were able to document before any management happened. So with a lot of the sites, they've had management over the years prior to when we started monitoring, but this site we got in at the beginning. And in 2015, our first year of monitoring, we only documented 2 out of our 17 focal species. That's black-crowned night heron and marsh wren. And then Chicago Park District, was in the process of acquiring this property and restoring it. And that involved water level control as well as herbicide of Phragmites. We saw a big regrowth of cattail, which provided more habitat for a lot of the marsh bird species. And we jumped from 2 species of our 17 to 8, and have kind of leveled out since then, actually, over the years. And also very exciting to see least bittern and common gallinule, again, species that are on our state threatened species list, now regularly breed at this site. So just going to show on this slide here, you can see the actual difference just between these 2 years. Oh, I think the battery might be dead on this clicker, but you can see in 2015 that there's a lot of open water and not a lot of vegetation in the marsh. And then in 2017, you get this regrowth of cattail that provided habitat that wasn't there before. So it's exciting for us to be able to show this, because we can tell that even in a very short time, it's like if you build it, they will come. Marsh birds come back very quickly once the habitat that they need is present. Oh, thank you. Wow, amazing. All right. So a few more results that have come out of this work now that we have so many, almost 10 years of data at this point. Well, some data from 2015, but most of our data sets started in 2017. We've actually been able to show that, so this is, again, this occupancy number or likelihood that these species are present for American bittern, common gallinule, Virginia rail, blue-winged teal, and least bittern. And they have been shown, most of these species over this period of time, almost 10 years, have had steady population trends. which is good news, right? Because we know a lot of these species are declining across their range, but if they're holding steady in Calumet, that means, we're doing something right. We do have a few species that have shown more negative decline trends, like American coot and black-crowned night heron, pied-billed grebe. So those are species that we're interested in maybe more about what's going on there. I know some of you are probably familiar. There's another group that's really digging in more on the black-crowned night heron trend, and that is a little bit beyond just what's happening in the marshes, because they also are colonial nesters. So there might be something more going on there. But for species like pied-billed grebe and American coot, these are species that need a lot of open water. And it could be that lower water levels in the past couple of years might be influencing their trends there, that they just need deeper water. And then swamp sparrow and marsh wren are just highlighted here as some of the species that we have very high occupancy for. So they're doing pretty well. It's also not surprising with some of the species like marsh wren and swamp sparrow, they don't need as much large area to breed in, so they can do well in even very small wetlands. And if you want to check out our Marshbird Data Hub and dig into the data more, it's interactive. It's a lot of fun to be able to explore the data and then change the different sites and years. This tool is available on our website for anybody to access, so you can scan this QR code if you'd like to check it out, or you can go to the Audubon Great Lakes website and navigate it to it, or just type in Audubon Marshbird Hub and you should be able to find the spot if you'd like to check out our data some more. Oh, sorry, if you want to, okay. And other fun things, I wish I could go on and on about what else is going on with our work in Calumet. I just want to highlight a really neat project that happened recently in the last couple of years at Powderhorn Lake. And it's connected to all this data collection, because since we're out at these sites collecting data year after year, it gives us really a good tool of being able to assess, where these sites are at, and then being able to do on the ground manipulation and then come back and say what happened, how are the birds responding, did we improve conditions, can we do something better. This was a project, Powderhorn Lake, which is just south of Wolf Lake and right on the border of the city of Chicago, Cook County Forest Preserve. We worked with the Cook County Forest Preserves to be able to reconnect Powderhorn Lake to Wolf Lake. And that was really something that was needed for many reasons, to alleviate some flooding pressure around the surrounding neighborhood, but also to give fish that are in Wolf Lake a safe place to breed, to spawn. So they come in from Wolf Lake, breed in Powderhorn, and then come back out. And it's really neat. If you happen to visit the site, you can go to these areas where you can actually see the fish moving from, Wolf Lake into these channels that was built that you can see right here. And we're hoping that, of course, this isn't just important for fish and for flooding, but it also, we hope that, this will also positively influence the marsh bird populations as well, because if we can drain the water down, we can, also see that regrowth of vegetation, because right now a lot of the lake is just, it's wide open with not a lot of vegetation immersed in it. So it's not necessarily providing the habitat that birds need yet, but we're excited to be able to see the results. So that's just one of the projects that we're working on in Calumet where we're using these data. So I am going to be, this is my last slide, but I'll just say, if you're interested in learning more about marsh bird monitoring, we are working with Indiana Audubon to recruit volunteers to do these surveys. That's the email address there. find out more about volunteer opportunities. And then super excited about 2 publications that are in the works that'll have results from this monitoring data out soon. So one is looking at what we call marsh bird habitat associations, but basically of these different species that are focal species, what are their exact habitat needs? They're not all the same. We know that they all like wetlands, they all need marsh habitat, but what a sorrel needs and what a pied-billed grebe needs is very different. How do we kind of find the best mix of habitats that satisfy both? That's what that paper will be talking about. And then these silly acronyms, ARU and eDNA, are referring to another project where we're collecting audio data. So that's ARU, audio recording unit, to see if putting a recorder out in the middle of the marsh to listen for birds is as good as a person going out in the field 3 times a year. No, so far hinting at a recording device is picking up more birds than a person would, but it's also very complicated and a time-intensive process. And eDNA means that they're actually collecting water samples to see if they can get DNA fragments from these different species and identify them that way. So it's really, really neat stuff that's happening. Excited to be able to share that. I'm sure that once those results are out, we'll be sharing those on the Audubon Great Lakes blog. So make sure you find out a way to subscribe to that if you want to learn more about when those studies come out. And then since I mentioned powderhorn in the last slide, I just wanted to mention we are coming up with a tour at Powderhorn Lake, a birding tour, but it'll also talk about more in detail about the restoration that happened there and is happening there through Chicago Water Week. It's not on the website yet, but just wanted to call that out and share that with you all in case you're interested in signing up. Should be available sometime in the next week or so. So with that, I will pass it over to Leo and he'll talk more about muskrats.
All right, onto the muskrat portion of our evening. So I'm here to talk to you today about muskrat ecology and how they shape wetlands with a very good intro on the marsh bird part from Stephanie. So first off, thinking about muskrats, how big are they? I hadn't ever seen a muskrat until I started working with them. It's not really something you encounter like day to day for most people. They're very small. I think bigger than a squirrel, smaller than a cat, but much closer to the squirrel size. They're really only about like this big. So think small rodent. They are in the rodent family. They are not actually as closely related to rats as their name may make them seem like they are. They're really actually more closely related to lemmings and voles. So think like water vole, that got an idea. So this is a baby one on the right side here. This was turned into a rehab center because it was orphaned. And then that's an adult size there on the left side there. So give you a sense of the muskrats themselves. And then their natural history. So how do muskrats live and how do they survive in the winter? Especially, they make these enormous lodges. Lodges or houses, this is their home. And so you can see relative to me, this is absolutely enormous. I mean, I'm standing in thigh deep water and it is about 5 feet across, so about this wide, and then 5 feet tall as well. And these enormous homes, they change the landscape itself. So you can see around that, there is a portion that's very open and an otherwise very dense cattail sand marsh there. And so they're creating not only a platform that exists within a wetland, but also this sort of open ring of space that's thinned out as well, which is good for things like waterfowl, you can imagine. And so why do they even make these? And why make such a big structure when you're such a little animal? So there is a dry chamber inside of these. So they're swimming underneath them. There's no like top opening. They swim underneath. There's a chamber on the inside that's above the water line, which is why it's shaped like an igloo there. And then they swim up into that. Part of the reason you have to do that is because even in the dead of winter, they still use them. So this is a picture from my cameras. When it is fully ice and there's snow on top of them, they're still living inside of these. And these are 20 degrees Celsius, so even more in Fahrenheit, over the air temp. So they are incredibly effective in terms of insulation. So that's why you would build that. Also, there's about like the estimate, maybe 5-ish that live inside. It varies, but it's not just one occupant up there. There's like a whole family inside there. And they are basically voracious herbivores. They're mostly herbivorous, but they do eat some. If they're kind of opportunistic, they'll eat it if they can get it. And so that's why they build these enormous lodges. And I'll talk about like, well, what are the effects of that? Because that's really going to change the system if you have a lot of those versus just a very dense stand of cattails or muddies or something like that. So muskrats are also, by the way, when they are in this state, so in the middle of the dead of winter, when there's ice there, they don't hibernate, by the way, so that's partially why they have to create this. They're swimming out underneath the ice every single day to go find vegetation, to find roots, just anything they can find underneath there, and then bringing it back to these or feeding platform areas that they can also swim to under the ice. And so it's a very tough existence for a muskrat. They definitely don't have a very easy life, but it's a very interesting niche that other things don't occupy, so they're able to survive. And they are basically like many rodents, as you can imagine. They have a sort of like the rabbit-based strategy of reproduction, which is just reproduce a lot and then just hope some survive. But the attrition rate, especially within the first year, is extreme, essentially. So this makes them ecosystem engineers. And just a quick definition, any species that creates, significantly modifies, destroys, or maintains a habitat. So the very classic ecosystem engineer is actually the beaver. They're not really that closely related, but they're both rodents technically. Beavers, by creating their dams that change the flow of rivers, they're creating habitat that doesn't otherwise exist and flooding is behind it. So that would be a super classic version. That's usually when people say that, people think of that one. Another example would just be the coral within a coral reef. They're creating a habitat that otherwise does not exist by just living in a certain space. So those would be two, and muskrats would absolutely be considered an ecosystem engineer as well. By creating those platforms and creating that space, they are significantly modifying the habitat. So the question I sought to look at first was, how do muskrats, by just being themselves, making their houses, impact bird diversity in marshes within the Calumet region? So here's how I thought this might go. So this is my hypothesized mechanism that I'll talk about here. So the muskrats, by creating their huge lodges, would then create areas of open water and interspersion within marshes, creating a hemi-marsh. And hemi-marsh is a fancy way to say 50% water, 50% vegetation. And when you have those mixed together, that is considered the best habitat for marsh bird populations. Healthy marsh bird populations are generally associated with healthy hemi-marsh. And so muskrats, by creating these open spaces, would then just naturally generate this type of space, and that wetland managers spend a lot of time trying to create, but they're kind of making it naturally, which is awesome. So that through like kind of the red arrow pathway here, by creating the houses, by creating the interspersion, probably facilitating and improving marsh bird populations in an indirect fashion, essentially. So through the blue arrow, they're indirectly promoting birds. So how would you look into this? I had two methods that I used to look into, is this mechanism perhaps correct? One, just cameras, what is on them? I mean, that's just very simply. And then two, creating models using the marsh bird monitoring data that Stephanie was talking about, and correlating it with the density of dens that we see within wetlands. So I'll just go through them in order. So one, looking at the cameras here, it's a very simple design. It's called the control impact. One camera pointing at the den and one camera pointing away at the vegetation. And then the difference will tell you what is that den adding to the picture here. So these are paired and they're right next to each other, essentially. So like one points one way, one pretty much just points the other way. So I had 7 pairs of these cameras out, so 14 total out across 3 different sites within the Calumet region. And then these cameras, they're called trail cameras, and they're actually designed kind of for hunters, funny enough, but you can program them to either take photos on motion or you can do it on a timer. Chicago is too windy to do motion because the plants just move back and forth and it just takes photos until the SD card fills up, and it's really useless, frankly. So instead I had it programmed to take one every 5 minutes. I don't have to tell you guys how quick birds are. A lot of things can move by a camera in 4 minutes and 59 seconds. I mean, I can't think of a bird that's slow enough where that would stick around. So I wasn't really sure what we were going to see on this, but there's kind of like this point where if you tell it to take a photo every 10 seconds, I end up with like 200,000 photos, and it's just too many. So 5 minutes was kind of the compromise between like, okay, I think I'm going to see some stuff, but it's not so overwhelming that I'm going to be spending years going through these photos. So I left them out for 2 weeks, and this was during spring migration season, so end of April, beginning of May. So yeah, I wasn't sure what I could see, and what I actually saw was really floored me, which is that I saw over 1,000 things in 2 weeks on the cameras, and it was just a complete and absolute landslide towards the muskrat dens, just not even close. we're talking like over a 20-fold increase. So that was extremely exciting and pretty apparent that, oh, yes, they are absolutely engineering the system pretty heavily for these birds here. And this was done during spring migration season. So as you can imagine, most of these are birds. It was 85%. So I'll show you what the pictures actually look like. So the number one thing on the camera is like hands down period was Soros. I saw almost 400 of them. And they absolutely loved these areas. They look like they're foraging. I mean, even this photo, it kind of looks like it's foraging on there. This is something I'm going to follow up on to try to figure out like why are they doing this? Not just they're using it, but what's the draw essentially. But yeah, so Soros were number one, and I'm also marked which ones were the Audubon focus species. So something I want to address when you are looking at cameras, one of the things that is sort of a limiting factor is that there's way more visibility in a camera that has a dent in it, so it has the kind of opening, versus a camera that is pointing to vegetation, it has stuff in the way just by the nature of it. You're a structural comparison, essentially, one type of structure and your camera one other type of structure. And so if I were to like clear it to make it easier to see, well, then it's not really a good comparison. That's not a control anymore. So yes, it is harder to see into the photos. However, all the birds that we were looking for, even something as small as a sparrow or a wren, would be wider than a cattail. So if it's within the frame enough where I could see it, even if it was holding onto it, I'd see like its butt or its beak or something. And so you can kind of see around it. So this is a sora. It's bending over. This is butt. And down there. And so after a while, I spent a lot of time like training my eye to see this stuff, because at first you just don't see it. And after a while, you kind of start to see this stuff. So yes, it is harder to see, but I think the results are very accurate overall. You know, of course, you miss things on both sides. So I just want to address that because that is a limitation of the study, of course, but it's inherent with this type. And Stephanie can probably attest that I sent her just the amount of like blurry Sora photos that were exchanged between the two of us when we were analyzing this. I was like, what do you think this is? Oh, I think that's a Sora. Oh, okay. So yeah, I can add to my CV, and probably you can add yours too. Identifying blurry Sora butts has become like something that I've gotten like absurdly good at now because of this study. So in terms of other things we saw there, waterfowl would definitely be drawn to the areas that it's creating around the lodge, and we did see that. So blue-winged teal were the number one that we saw there, which is really nice because they're focal species as well. But that was really interesting to see. Swamp sparrows also really lived up to their name, which like I appreciate that, and use these lodges as well, and we just kind of stay on the top of those within the photos. And black-crowned night herons were an especially exciting one to see because they're state endangered in both Illinois and Indiana. And this photo itself was really cool to see because it kind of tells the story of this entire study in one photo here. You have this interesting coexistence of the black-crowned night heron on the left side, the sora foraging in the middle. Again, what's with the sora butts? And then on the right side, we have a muskrat here also foraging. So there are like not always, but there were sometimes like multiple things that would just show up in a single photo without any like issue really, which is cool. And you can just see that one's just foraging off the side in the open water there. So super exciting to see a state endangered species on these lodges. So I mentioned that birds were, the hypermajority of what we saw was 85%, but that was not it. We had mammals as well, and reptiles and amphibians. I won't get too much into all these because there's thousands of photos I could show you. We could be here all night. But reptiles and amphibians, the number one that we saw there were common snapping turtles. Really liked these lodges, as well as painted turtles like them as well. And in terms of snakes, during the summer, you will see water snakes really enjoy sitting on top of these and just basking on top of the lodges because it's like open canopy as well as being like just a general opening. But in terms of mammals, the number one that you would expect to see would of course be the muskrat itself. I mean, that was the number one mammal, as it should be. And this is just it maintaining its lodge. It does this, by the way, mouthful by mouthful. So it's just adding constantly more and more vegetation on top of here because it's slowly subsiding like basically constantly into the water. And a reminder, this water is like, it's like thigh deep on me. So it's pretty, there's a lot of things that this muskrat is fighting against, so this lodge just collapsing. So anyway, muskrat lodges, now that, I've talked about them, you've seen a bunch of pictures of them. If you saw this on the landscape, you would probably say like, yes, that is a muskrat lodge. It's very distinctive. There really is nothing else that could possibly be, and nothing would just like magically create something that huge, right? So people certainly know what muskrat lodges look like. They are also, by the way, a legally hunted fur bearer animal in every Great Lakes state that I know of, and also is pretty much without bag limit, so you can just hunt a lot of them if you want to. They're really just trapped most of the time. So muskrats have long been a fur bearer species, even going back to when people were taking pelts in like the late 1800s for hats and stuff. Muskrats also snuck their way in there. Not called that, by the way. That's not good marketing. So it's called like, I think like river mink or something to that effect. Something that made it sound more like, ooh. But anyway, so people definitely know what muskrat lodges look like. The other thing that knows what they look like are their predators, like coyotes. And so this coyote is plunging its head into the chamber. So it understands that the structure internally of a muskrat lodge, roughly, or it must, because it's hitting right where the chamber would be. So it's trying to eat the inhabitants out of it. This is, it's nice to know that at May 10th, 2022 at 3:50 p.m. that my camera trapping career peaked here, because I'll never get something this good again, and I'm fine with that. This was super cool. And remember, 5-minute timer shot. This was not like motion sensors. This is really cool that I got that second. So I screamed when I opened this up, of course. I was on my computer like, so this is really cool. To see a predation event in just a 2-week period out here, it tells you, one, this is probably somewhat common if I'm seeing this in just 2 weeks. And two, that muskrats are facing a lot of pressure, and it makes sense why it is that they're producing just tons of babies, right? Because everything on different sides is trying to basically eat them. Mink also are their #1 predator, by the way. Coyote are huge as well, but mink are #1. So anyway, this coyote is looking for a meal here. I don't know. People ask me like, did it get one? It's really hard for me to tell. With the 5 minutes between every shot, I can't really tell. And there's a bunch of muskrats that live in there. They do eventually rebuild it. Actually, they just like repair it and move on, but. Yeah, hard to say. But the coyotes need to get some food too. So overall, we saw 18 different species on top of these lodges, and we saw only 6 in the control. So that's a 3 times increase in species richness, which is a fancy way to say unique species. And 3 times increase is huge. I mean, that is really, truly enormous. And it was a pretty wide variety here. So besides just the cameras, we also did some modeling to see like, okay, how do muskrat dens correlate with bird occupancy rates? So bird occupancy rates, Stephanie already talked about them. They're of course like, it's a probability, not a count. So 0 to 1. And then those already existed from all the marsh bird monitoring that Audubon already does. And so we wanted to correlate that with muskrat den density. However, muskrat den density is not a metric that we already had. It's not part of the marsh bird monitoring survey. So you just can't see that. You'd have to walk through the entire marsh and count every single one and then say, okay, how big is it? And then get a density from there. So it would be pretty crazy to do it. And you really can't see them, especially when the vegetation is really tall. And so the thing was, we had the data going back to 2017. So you don't want to leave good data on the table, right? So I wanted to use all the data going back that far, but how could you physically go back in time and count every single muskrat lodge that was at all 31 different Calumet sites for every single one? I mean, you'd be out there for days, even if you did that 1 year. So the answer is, how do you count them? You can count them from space because they're so big, you can see them on satellite imagery. And so I used Google Earth, and I just would slide it back to the year we were looking at, and then I would count them from there. And this is like a pretty one. If the satellite takes it at a time of year where it's not as clean, it can be very hard to see. But best case scenario, I just circled 10 on here, but you can see there's a lot more of these dots. So you can see the lodge and then that ring of open water around it that they create. It's visible from space, which is really cool. And so from that, we were able to do a count. So I just sat and I counted all of them. And from there, you can get the density per size. And then we created a correlation with the occupancy rates that we already had. And the answer is that actually muskrat den density does matter a lot. For 4 out of 11, it was a significant covariate to explain their occupancy rate, which is really huge. So muskrats really seem to matter, I guess is the takeaway here, pretty much is what I'm saying. So you can tell if people ask why the shapes. So the shapes are really different. So this is just a few years of data I want to point out. And we're adding more, that's the goal here, but we just haven't added it yet. The top two, so Gallinule and Coot would be much more related than these other two here. So it makes sense that I would guess it's a life history thing, like something about their life history is correlating with this space here. So since those two are similar and their shape is similar, it's probably that, but we'll look into it more. This, I don't know why, it's probably just we don't have enough data yet to make it nice and smooth. And this is great. I love this because this tells us like this is the spot. So it's nice when it's a great curve like that. But anyway, why the shapes, we'll figure it out. So I'll also say between the camera trapping and the modeling here, this suggests that the mechanism that I proposed is right. That muskrats are probably just indirectly facilitating birds by creating their lodges, which is really huge and is a big deal. So what we call this in the business is a positive species interaction, which is a fancy way to say one species is positively affecting another set of species. That's it. So, but that's the fancy word that we use to kind of get at that facilitation there. And these are a really big idea and a big like thing right now in like theoretical ecology. And we're trying to basically incorporate them into conservation and restoration projects because historically those two different things haven't really bridged each other very well. Like you have the theory over here, and then it tends to maybe kind of not connect to what happens on the ground sometimes. Okay, so the key here would be how do you harness this positive species interaction? So the blue arrow, how do you harness that? Like that's the really big deal here. So that is basically the thing I'm working on now is how do you take the lodges and clearly they're having an impact on birds, and then how do you use that in a conservation and restoration sense? So going back to this mechanism, so one way that you could do this is that you could take the muskrats and say, well, more muskrats are good, and we know that there's not maybe enough at this site, so let's just like take the muskrats and just throw them into this wetland over here, and then hope they do their thing, and then get up to this density that we know is useful. As maybe weird as that would be to do, and kind of fun, I'll be honest, that's not possible because muskrats are not doing well in terms of their population. They have been in decline for over 50 years, and so we just don't have enough to just boost that as we please, which is a shame for other reasons, and it's something that people don't even talk about or are not really aware of. So because they're kind of under a population crisis, and we're talking like 95% down. So you can see, because you can see from satellite, there are lodges. You can also see in old aerial imagery, even from like 100 years ago, how many lodges there are in a given space. So you can compare it to today. And we see like 95% declines in some areas, which is really freaky. And why is that? A combination of, I mean, there are wetland obligate species. They don't do well outside of wetlands. So if you develop the wetlands and make like housing or something, that's going to really take the population. Just by developing it, you fragment it. They are not good at walking on land and they get picked off really easily. So there's been studies that have shown that some only live within like 500 meters of where they're born. They can go like a few miles away, but I population. So fragmentation is a big one. They are actively hunted as well, but it's really like the distant third, I would say. It's more the first two that are the big deal. And these are just the theories right now. It's actually very hard to know because you're really using mostly tracking data as a proxy for population, but there are so many other things that affect how much people trap, like pelt prices and all sorts of stuff. So anyway, not to get too deep in the nitty-gritty, but yes, the population is really falling a lot. So, okay, more muskrats is out. So then you got to move to the next kind of like piece here within the mechanism, which is the lodge part. So my idea is, what if you just built the lodge part? If that is the kind of the link here that is linking it to the birds, what if you just built a ton of muskrat lodges, like human-made mimic ones, put them in the landscape and saw, do they respond the same way to a human-made one as they would to a muskrat-made one? And so that is what I'm doing with the next 3 years of my life. So I'm trying to figure out how would you do that? So, and to recap, I went from studying muskrats to being a muskrat, which is like, that's how it goes. Let's be real. So that's the next part is, and I'm kind of working on it, but it's very hard to do because it turns out people don't really do this. So I'm just prototyping lots and lots of different ideas right now. So I made a tiny prototype, and this is to give you a sense of the scale. It's really only about like this big, and the big, obviously the ones are larger. But just putting this in, and this is about 3 feet tall, because it's just barely like cresting the water here. You can see that the muskrats have already christened it with their like, just kind of sitting there. And I'm hoping this is kind of their seal of approval in a weird way. But you can see that they're actually using this like small mimic prototype that I made. And so they seem to be responding, which is really cool. And I'm still working on this. I don't have it like completely figured out yet, but we're in the process right now and we're in early stages. So that was really neat to see them use this like small mimic that I had. The other thing actually that used them even more than birds, and to be fair, this was kind of like not necessarily during like the absolute peak of migration, but were turtles. Turtles really like basking on top of these. And this great blue heron that I saw just kind of standing there preening, and starlings for some reason, a bunch of them really liked this little prototype that I made. So I'm working on it, and I'm kind of hoping that if you build it, they will come. So fingers crossed. But yeah, anyway, that is my like big idea is how would you take something that is really, useful. And I mean, these ecosystem engineers have been living with these birds for, thousands of years in the Great Lakes, right? Something that is already super existent. And by the way, muskrats are native to the Great Lakes, if I didn't state that already. They're native and they live throughout all of North America from Alaska down to Mexico. So they are incredibly adaptive animals. And so they should be there. And anyway, so how would you use this like on a really high scale? So one thing would be that the Department of Natural Resources for US states and then also the provinces in Canada could take this and they could say, okay, we want to conserve like, black night herons or, common gallinules or something like that. And they could take these curves and say like, at what point would this make sense to build this density and build that into future wetland restoration? So you could say like this many lodges should be in every square kilometer, for example, and that would potentially create enough niches and spaces that would help with that bird population. So that would be one way that you could use this. I mean, besides the obvious, just like this is helpful for bird conservation generally, but I don't think I have to sell that to you guys. And then the other kind of cool thing with this is muskrats are very scrappy and they use invasive cattails and phragmites to make their lodges, because it's not like they really have a lot of choices, if I'm being honest. That's pretty much what's there. But they do actually use that. So when I make my mimic ones, I use that too. I use it at the same ratio that I see on their lodges. And so you take invasive species like these cattails, and Stephanie took this picture of me. She's like 5 feet from me, by the way, to give you a sense of how awful it is if you've never walked through these before. So when I was permitting with the park district, I asked them if I could cut them down. They're like, oh, have fun. Like, please cut out as much phragmites and cattail as you possibly want to make your lodges. And I was like, great. So yeah, permitting process was very easy. So it gives, not only is this useful in the conservation sense, it is useful in the sense that future managers could say, I need to control this invasive species anyway. Let me use them for like a good cause that is going to also be helpful in other respects down the line. So that's kind of nice. I would always be remiss if I don't say that lots of people help me when I do this work. I certainly do not do it alone. I don't want to go off that impression, especially if like when I have like younger people in the room that might go into this field. Like, don't ever do this stuff alone. That's a really bad idea. So I always have tons and tons of collaborators that I work with, including Stephanie. And yeah, I'm always very thankful for all their help in the field and also all of their ideas that have made this project what it is. And Stephanie and I have been working on this since 2021, by the way. So it's been a long time in the works. So I also want to thank my funders, Smith Fellows, which is the postdoc fellowship that I have, Indiana Department of Natural Resources, the NSF, Duke University, and then my partners. I work at the University of Chicago, work with Audubon Great Lakes, and then the people that gave us permits to work on their land, Chicago Park District, and the Little Calumet River Basin Development Commission. So our takeaways. This is our last slide. So 1, birds can help tell us how to manage wetlands for wildlife. 2, when we change things, birds take notice, which is really cool. I mean, looking at Stephanie's graph with like the difference in species richness at Big Marsh, you can see that there is that really quick response time, which makes them a great proxy for it, but also they benefit really insanely. And this is really important to, wetlands are really important. We should work to restore them and conserve them everywhere, but Calumet is just a particularly important region. And native ecosystem engineers like the muskrats, native ecosystem engineers are really important and they help facilitate birds and are really important to work into your conservation and restoration efforts because they should be there and I think they deserve to be. And this is maybe simplistically, but on a high level, this is really true. Muskrats are friends to the birds. So without them, we don't have as many niches and spaces that they can use. So if you really love birds, you should also love muskrats as well by extension. And that's it.
Questions in the chat, and I know chat.
Go ahead.
People always get the short
chat
answers,
stuff.
so maybe we could address some of those first. How long after a bird's presence can DNA be detected from the exposed water?
Oh, okay. So this is a question about eDNA. So I am not an expert. We partner with the Illinois Natural History Survey to collect that data, and they would know better than me. So I might have to look up that information precisely, but I do know that DNA does degrade over time. So As far as we go out and collect it 3 times during the season to kind of line up with when we go out and send volunteers out. And that is kind of like in line with, how quickly it can degrade and disappear from the environment. So, I don't know precisely, but it does have kind of a short turnaround time. So it's like, you're not going to go in and collect a water sample and collect DNA from something that's been there like a year ago. It's going to disappear within a month or so.
It's another one. Do muskrats build their lodges solely of vegetation, or do they incorporate mud?
They do incorporate mud. Yes. Yeah, it's more it's vegetation heavy, but yes, they do use it. Kind of, I guess, what I'm thinking is that it's kind of like mortar, like you're kind of like sealing things, essentially.
So here's one asking, someone who sees muskrats on a cattail covered shoreline, it seems like they dive down to enter their home along the shore, but there doesn't seem to be a separate lodge.
Yes. Yes, I guess I forgot to. I don't study. They do make burrowing bank lodges as well. It's actually the same exact thing where they have like a tunnel and then it kind of comes up to a dry chamber. But you need a pretty tall bank to do it. So they definitely can't do it everywhere. Yeah, so they do that as well. I forgot to mention that, but I don't study that because it doesn't really create like an ecosystem engineering effect, right? Like they're just living there, but they're not creating that space and they're not creating the platform. So there's not really as much of an impact, actually, weirdly. Someone should do a study
That we
on
know
that.
of, yeah.
That we know. I mean, I guess it could totally have an impact, but it's definitely not creating the platform, right? So yes, they do that, and that is like another method, but that's just not. It's hard to put a chemical on that, basically.
Phragmites, it doesn't sound like a very nourishing plant for muskrats to eat. And I know that it's taken over like a lot of the marshes and wetlands. And I would assume that could be a problem with having that habitat for muskrats.
Yeah, it is less nourishing. Yeah, you're correct, I guess, in your leading that cattails are much more nutritionally valuable to them. And like anecdotally, when we find muskrat lodges, they tend to be in the cattail region. To be fair, cattail also seems to grow deeper into the water than the Phragmites does. So part of that's just because they have to swim into it. But I also think that they're probably keying into that as well, where why wouldn't you want to be around a higher quality food source? It kind of makes sense. So yeah, I do think that they kind of understand that like, oh, this is a better thing for me to be eating overall.
Did you use Phragmites in your project?
Yeah, I did. Because I see it on their lodges, I can just see it on the top of there. So I built it in as well, like a smaller ratio, just to be accurate, essentially.
And one more thing, the open area around the lodges, that attracts obviously more sunlight.
Mm-hmm.
And that means more insects. And so the fact that the open area will attract more than the dense area where cattails are thick and your photographs, they show more activity.
Yeah,
around there because if it's being an open area as well.
Yeah, so I am studying that now. So I'm like while I'm out, I'll just like take scrapes essentially to see what insects are emerging in that area. It's kind of a trade-off because for the insects being in an open area means they're easier to eat. So other things, particularly fish predation, becomes higher in open spaces because you can just line of sight. And so yeah, it's kind of those funky things where like, yes, you would think that just having more open space would be good for them, but it also is good for their predators. So I'm trying to figure out if there's sort of like this kind of like U-shape effect where it's kind of good on one end, but then a little too much is bad. So anyway, I'm studying that. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm looking at it now.
No answer needed.
Yeah.
Just observation.
Yep. Oh.
There was from one of our local preserves, there was a pond where there were multiple dens, muskrat dens. And on top of almost every one was a Canada goose nest. And I didn't see any nesting. Is that unusual for that to happen, or, and how does that affect anything? Because the Canada goose can be kind of an aggressive protector of their nest.
Yeah, so this is just because it was too early that I didn't have that happen. And also because I can't put a camera on an active goose nest because they would beak me. And so there were ones I thought about using and I was like, oh, nope. But I mean, I love the geese, like personally, so I'm like really biased. But the thing about like when you see like even the coyote predating them, geese are so aggressive that I think a coyote would think twice about trying to access that lodge. And so I think actually in reality, it's probably not the worst thing for a muskrat, which is, I mean, very much a prey animal to have something essentially 24/7 security on top of its, you know, that I don't actually think it's a bad thing. So that would be a really interesting study to do. But yeah, it's also just hard to study because the goose is kind of like a difficult, like, hey, I want to take like, I want to see how many insects are on there. And it would be like, no, like, I don't know what you're doing, like, go away. So yeah, I don't actually think it's a bad thing, but yeah, that is like actually very common. And swans, I think, probably would do it too. There just aren't as many swans around, so I haven't seen it as often. Yes.
So is this this was your doctoral thesis, or is this information like widely known that they have this big of an impact on wetlands, or this is like a new thing that you personally are studying?
It was not a part of my doctoral thesis. It probably should have been, but no, this is actually a humongous side project. I actually am a trained marine scientist, so I did it on like completely different stuff. This was just like a grant that we wrote on the side actually, but I would say it is known that they're ecosystem engineers. It is known that they have an effect. This type of camera trap data is not something that had really been done that much before.
I asked because it seems like they have an outsized influence on their environment in a way that impacts a lot of other species that are more critically concerned and more glamorous to the public, I guess. And like the average suburban homeowner, I'm one that I love beavers, but I would NIMBY them if they were in my yard cutting down my trees. Nobody has a bias against them cutting down cattails. So has there been any talk with like state DNRs about banning or limiting the trapping of them? Because we ran into a muskrat trapper at Oregon. He said they were all going to like Eastern European export markets anyway. So like, I think people don't give a shit about these things being tracked because they're rats, you know, but since they seem to have a positive influence on their environment and they don't cut down the trees in your yard, I don't think the average suburbanite would mind them being protected.
Yeah, they among people that know them, I have heard mixed things, but some of the people find them to be a huge nuisance because they don't aesthetically like them in their ponds, or because of the bank dens, less like what I'm showing, but the bank dens can mess with like water control structures, you can imagine, because they're burrowing really deep, like to get into this, like have a chamber that large. So there are some cases where I kind of understand people's frustration with them.
Sure.
But yeah, they are just less known, frankly. And yeah, they're
Be a pretty small market for like trapping. And it benefits a very small amount of people, but it causes more damage to the environment than I think most people realize.
perhaps, yeah, there is a max. So there is a point at which if you have enough muskrats that they will just like destroy all the vegetation in the entire wetland. So there's this like natural boom bust cycle if you do nothing to manage them that happens. You definitely would want to actually avoid that. So there is a place for trapping actually, where you would want to kind of keep them at that middle ground where they create like the nice amount of hemi-marsh and not just like completely destroy everything and make it a
They should take care of that though.
Not the muskrat
depends.
migration.
It depends. I don't know the answer, I guess. And also with the populations being so sometimes sparse, it's again hard to say, right? But there's not really any clear research for me to point to on that actually.
Sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I have two questions. One is harmful algae blooms. Does that have any impact on muskrats and their decline? And the other thing is how about the aquatic invasive plants, like rainwater milfoil or really pondweed or any of those? Does that have any negative impact on?
I've never seen a study on that, and I don't study that, so I don't know the answer, but I wouldn't be shocked. But I don't know the answer to that actually. Yeah, go for it.
I guess I have a number of questions, but I'll just focus on
just the structure itself that you were talking about. I wondered how much of that open water is caused by the structure, the use of the plants around them to make the structure. You also mentioned that they're year-round, they're moving through that water, keeping the water open. So how do all that, I guess I'm looking for the interactions of the structure and their behavior and how that's impacting them, the other species around them, because it looks like there are a number of things going on here.
Yeah, it's you're right. It is like a lot of it is how much vegetation they need to create that structure to begin with. So that's a lot of the initial open water section is that. Then they maintain it through herbivory because they need to keep eating. And then they are creating like channels essentially. You can kind of see it a little bit. You wouldn't have been able to see it in the photos that I sent, but or I had up there, but they essentially are creating like almost a highway system within wetlands to move between them because I mean it's just not easy to move between cattails that are that closely spaced to each other. And so they'll create like consistent pathways, and they're called like rivulets, I think, within the literature, but essentially they're pathways that they can follow that are consistent to get to different areas of the wetland. So they have like maintained like a semi-network plus that open area as well.
I have a question for Stephanie.
Yep.
The call and response thing you had mentioned, that was really good. Did I mention
Yes.
that? How are they projecting the call part? Like you're playing a recording of birds.
Yes.
What are they playing on?
Oh, we use Bluetooth speakers.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's pretty loud.
That's actually
Yeah.
why I was asking. I sell those as a product and I was curious.
Oh.
Just using like a tape recorder and.
Yeah.
Oh, and is the remote recording thing too, is there any capability to do that where it can be recording remotely and like transmitting wirelessly or something like that?
You know, we don't do that. The products that we use, they're made by Wildlife Acoustics. It's called a song meter. And we use an SD card to collect the data, and then so we have to go back out and collect it.
You mentioned that part, yeah.
Yeah, so that is something that people are looking into, and we've been contacted by researchers who are developing products that can connect wirelessly, and they're actually trying to make it so that it can actually, many of you are probably familiar with Merlin, right? So that's kind of similar to the technique we use with the data when we take it back and to plug it into the computer. We like run it through a program that acts similarly to Merlin to identify the species. But there's people who are actually figuring out how to upload it wirelessly and then plug it directly in, and then it outputs results immediately. So that is something that's being developed, but we're not currently using it because this is just what we had at the time. So we're exploring, some of those options as they become more readily available. Yep.
So you both talked about and established if you restore habitat, the birds come back more readily. But Leo, I think you may have said something about this, but I missed it. If you restore marsh habitat, the muskrats still travel over land well. So are there barriers to them naturally, sort of natural restoration for muskrats? Or are there things that can be done? Granted, I know you're building lodges, but are there people made an earnest effort to repopulate muskrat population to restore margins?
Gosh, not that I know of. That would be very interesting. I'm sure like that probably will eventually be something that I end up advocating for, but yeah, they would have to traverse land. The biggest problem for them is water depth. So if the water is like a 1.5 feet would be like the lowest I think I've ever seen, but really like 2 feet plus is what you want for them to be able to swim underneath. So the biggest thing for managers, I'm probably gonna end up saying in the future, is the water level just can't be too low. If it's too low, they just can't feasibly live there. So yeah, I'm gonna guess in the long term of this project that I'll have to start like thinking about just not how like would I just make a lodge, but then like how would you kind of like back engineer it for the muskrats naturally as well. So yeah. That's a good question.
Is it true though that they don't sort of the populations don't naturally restore?
Um,
Or is
I,
that?
I am not sure what the answer to that actually is, because I know they can move pretty far overland if they absolutely have to, but it's just unlikely. So there would be some distance at which, yeah, that would just probably be impossible, would be my guess. So yeah, something else to think about.
I would add that, something that we talk about a lot with like thinking about restoring wetlands is making sure that we're increasing connectivity between habitats, and that's good for birds, muskrats, and so many other types of wildlife, especially like things like salamanders that, move even shorter distances and have issues like roads to combat with. But that's one thing where if we're focusing on a landscape level, not just restoring site by site, but making sure that there's connections between sites that you can get from one wetland to another, then that'll be good for so many species. And, muskrats can travel between sites by waterways. And as long as those connections are there, then they should be able to repopulate areas.
A couple of these
Oh.
ones from the chat, we should wrap it up. You have to be out of here.
Okay.
How many litters do muskrats have in a year? And basically, what do muskrats eat? Do they eat plants and seaweed? Is their food source declining, leading to their population? What do they eat?
I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it's multiple litters a year. And that they have starting very early. So like they probably would already be trying to reproduce, like even this early in the year. Then in terms of food source, because they can eat invasive stuff, I think that they probably have food, but there's probably people that study their diet more than I do that would know the answer to that question, but they can eat a wide range of things. They can eat like bivalves like clams. I've seen papers about that, but they are generally known as like herbivores, I would say overall. But
The picture here demonstrates that.
yes, they're generally considered herbivores, but yeah, they can eat other stuff too if they want to. But that's something of a stereotype and not what I've seen personally.
Yeah, a couple of things. So you showed a coyote that was drawn out into the waterfowl habitat by muskrats. Do they predate the ducks while they're out there? In other words, is there a negative effect that you're encouraging as well as a positive one?
I mean, coyotes eat pretty much anything
Anything.
that,
Yeah,
they love mammals, definitely, but they would predate like ducks and geese. Wouldn't have any information really on that, because that would be pretty hard to. I mean, if you're talking about like some of the secretive marsh birds that we're studying.
You didn't see any dead birds in any of your pictures from, or feather stacks left over from coyote predation?
No, I mean that was the only time. I mean, it's 2 weeks is pretty short. That was like the only time that we saw it on there, and it was pretty much obviously going for the muskrats. So hard to extrapolate further than that.
Yeah,
but
and they're everywhere. Coyotes, there's tons of them in Calumet, and they're very widespread and travel long distances. They're all over. I don't think like creating muskrat dens is going to make a difference in like where they're going and what they're eating. They're just going after whatever they can get.
Yeah.
Okay, so the other question I had, beavers were mentioned a couple of times. Is the presence of beaver equally beneficial, or is it just these spotty dens that are good for birds?
Beavers are really beneficial, but in a very different way. When you change flow versus like static structure, muskrats can live in rivers, to be clear. I just don't study in that context, but it's just very different effect when you're changing river flow versus creating essentially like a platform and opening. So yes, they would have other effects, but it's just different. It would be for different things, basically.
Yeah, and we do have issues with beavers actually at that Powderhorn Lake project that we were talking about. So we installed a water control structure, and they just plopped their beaver dam right on top of that, because that's what they do. They stop the flow. So you'll find a lot of mixed opinions on that, but I had sent Leo a link to a study in southern Wisconsin where they were doing basically the same thing, mimic beaver dams to kind of recreate different conditions based on their study sites up there. I think it was in Beloit, so I'd have to look more into that, but there's things like that happening.
One more question and then we'll have to cut it off. So I'm only giving us one more because you had your hand raised. Just bring it back.
Question, did you run across any studies on fish populations in conjunction with muskrats and birds? Because obviously, if it's, if you have more fish, you're gonna have more birds. If you have more muskrats, I mean, did you find anything in the correlations?
There is no literature that looks at that, although I agree with your hypothesis that it probably does affect it. I don't know why it wouldn't, they're creating areas of open water. So, but it's honestly just never really been studied. So that is something in the future that I've thought about studying. Yeah, potentially. It's a little harder to do in the controls just because there's some more stuff in the way, but yeah, I do think that's probably the case. So yeah, future directions.
Yeah, though a lot of the birds that we're studying don't necessarily eat fish. A lot of them eat insects and whatever aquatic invertebrates and plants and all kinds of things. So but I'm sure there's a relationship. That's a really interesting question.
Thank you both.